If you want to understand the war plans of the world's most powerful alliance, sometimes you need to get escorted off stage by a Secretary General, talk to a Deputy Secretary General, hear from an Assistant Secretary General, and chat with a French Foreign Minister. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me restart. Have you ever wondered if European officials are truly worried about a US abandonment of the continent? Or if hawkish politicians just use the perception of that threat to help pass more defense spending through their difficult legislatures? Well, good news. We can get a clear answer to that. We just need to look where they are spending the money. So all we need to do is get a hold of NATO's war plan to defeat Russia, which somehow did not exist until 2019, and still cannot be implemented for a few more years. Sadly, though, the war plans are not simply sitting somewhere on a bookshelf, and that is how I personally ended up in the Netherlands. So, yeah, this is a long story. Get comfortable. Let's back up for a moment. Since Trump returned to office in January, intra-Western alliance relations have been complicated, to say the least. There was the legacy of threats to withdraw from NATO during Trump's first term, talks with Governor Trudeau about how great Canada would be as a 51st state, and the wonderful opportunity that would be the annexation of Greenland. Much of the rhetoric from the White House stemmed from frustrations that Europe and Canada had been free-riding on American security guarantees for far too long. It was not a new sentiment, but Trump drew a much firmer line than previous administrations had, leading to public perceptions about the U.S. commitment to protect allies. That went double for those not spending the 2% of GDP on defense, which NATO had set as its standard at the 2014 Wales Summit. Canada and Europe seemed to respond by criticizing the Trump administration for betraying the alliance's foundational principle, that an attack against one is an attack against all, codified in the famous Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. The only solution, suggested their leaders, was to increase defense spending, so that Europe's security did not depend on the United States. You can see the irony here. Trump gets upset about Europe's lack of defense spending. Europe, upset at Trump's rhetoric, responds by raising European defense spending. All the while, NATO officials insisted that Washington's commitment to the alliance was never in question, a topic that you may recall I directly asked Secretary General Mark Rutte about a few months ago. They largely think that Trump is right in his free-riding criticism, and believe that the continent has been made worse off by not taking its own defense seriously. They may be a bit irritated with Trump's attitude about the situation, but they would prefer to work with the United States, and are not worried that the United States will ignore Europe's security needs. In fact, a skeptic might tell you that this is all one elaborate political power play by European hawks, who have wanted to increase defense spending for more than a decade. This is now finally their chance to do so. And there are plenty of such individuals. The problem is that military spending, surprise, costs money, and convincing voters to increase taxes or decrease social spending is not easy. However, voters in Europe and Canada absolutely hate Trump. Thus, such hawkish politicians had a clear winning strategy: play up Trump's threat of abandonment, convince voters to approve more defense spending, and then continue along with transatlantic relations as though nothing happened. Case in point, the rise of current Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Heading into Canada's election in April, the ruling Liberal Party appeared to be facing a disaster. Longtime Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had become so unpopular that he had no choice but to step down from his position and pray that someone else would salvage the situation. Meanwhile, the main opposition seemed friendly to Trump, leaving skeptics to label them the MAGA Party of Canada. I guess that McGA does not quite have the same ring to it. Anyway, it turned out that the only thing that Canadians hated more than the Liberal Party was Donald Trump, and, by extension, the opposition. What seemed impossible only a couple of months before then happened. The Liberal Party won, and Mark Carney retained his position as Prime Minister. Carney then began implementing an elbows-up policy of raising defense spending, a very Canadian way of telling someone to prepare for a fight, as if squaring up against an opponent in a hockey game. It was directed toward Trump in expression, but all of those weapons would be useful for fighting a more traditional foe. Following that, Carney visited the White House, where Donald Trump heaped praise upon him. Oh, and Trump also suggested that Carney would not have won without Trump, which, while may very well be true, still drew this look from Carney. And we are seeing it now on a macro scale, with the Allies now agreeing to spend 5% of GDP on defense coming out of the Hague summit. If this was a master plan by European hawks, not only has it worked to raise spending levels, but it has also changed Trump's rhetoric. Over at the summit, when asked about Article 5, Trump said that the United States is with its allies all the way at this press conference, a much cheerier message than has recently been the case. And that's the thing about collective action problems. If, for example, Spain is at the bottom of spending levels, it not only hurts Spain's national security, it hurts everyone else's in the alliance. Thus, it is possible that even if another country, say Italy, was also below the spending bar, Italy would prefer a world in which it, Spain, and all the other allied countries spend the proper total. The tricky part is getting an enforcement regime together to prevent parties from pulling out of spending agreements, which, at least thus far, has been a sticky wicket. The Hague Summit seems to have moved things in the right direction, though our discussion of enforcement will have to wait for another video, and whether it will actually work, looking at you especially Spain, is only something that time can tell. Nevertheless, a disconnect remains. Scroll through any online comments, and it will not take long to find people that are still completely convinced that Trump is 2 seconds away from abandoning Europe altogether. But despite NATO's insistence that Article 5's mutual defense commitment is ironclad, or Trump's aforementioned comments that the United States is with them all the way, the skepticism remains. And, you know what? Fair enough. Following our favorite axiom, if we really want to know how Canadian and European leaders feel about the situation, we need to find something that they would do if they were truly unconcerned about Trump, that they would not do if they were truly concerned about him. That is when I remembered a conversation I had with Andres Gannon, a professor at Vanderbilt University, whom you might remember from an interview over on Lines on Maps Extra last month.
Hey.
Hey, Andres. Do you remember that conversation we had right after we got done recording? The one about how NATO's spending priorities reveal a lot about members' true beliefs about the United States?
We were talking about the strategic complementarities that countries and alliances can have, ways in which if each country builds distinct military capabilities from one another, overall they're in a better position than they would be otherwise.
Yes, strategic complementarities. Hard to say, but very important for alliance relations. This is the idea that NATO countries try to avoid duplicating effort. Rather, they focus on military production that enhances the systems that others own. For example, you might have Germany obsess over tank production. Meanwhile, you can get Estonia obsessed with building infrastructure that can handle tanks driving west to east. The more tanks that Germany has, the more attractive it is for Estonia to build bridges. The more bridges that Estonia has, the more attractive it is for Germany to build tanks. Combine that together with how some countries are just better at building certain things, and you get what Rutte describes as a more lethal alliance. It is a classic win-win. But Andres, I think you had an even more insightful point. You were saying that this strategy requires some level of trust. If Europe does not trust the United States, it would begin investing in redundant capabilities. So it would be bad news, for example, to discover that France was building aircraft carriers given the US fleet.
Yes, there'd be a redundant capability with what the United States has. It'd be better if France was providing some sort of medium airlift capacity to get across the European continent.
Then what you're telling me is that if we want to know what European leaders are actually thinking, what we really need is to see NATO's war plans?
We need to look at the war plans.
Well, that can't be too difficult. All I have to do is get in touch with an old friend. Dear Secretary General, could you please send me your war plans? Warmest regards, William Spaniel. Surely I will hear right back. So I got on a flight to Amsterdam, then jumped on a train, and after a good amount of classic Dutch countryside, I arrived at The Hague, the seat of the government of the Netherlands, and the site of this year's NATO summit. That is when the real detective work began. The summit generated a ton of headlines about increases in Allied defense spending, but also a ton of question marks about where that money was actually going. Well, I got a big hint from François-Marie Goujon, NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning. He said that the new spending targets actually have a much longer historical legacy, and one that I am oh so happy to dive into. Remember that 5% number? 1.5 percentage points are for defense-related expenses, which are not important for us right now. 3.5 percentage points are for core defense, or what you might think of as the men and metal needed to defeat Russia. Tanks, planes, artillery, and so forth. And I do not mean that in the sense that more soldiers and more weapons put NATO in a better position in case the Kremlin invades. No, I mean that is actually what NATO's military planners think that they need. As in, they sat down and figured this out. Rewind to 2019. As hard as it may be to believe, NATO did not have a defense plan against Russia had war broken out then. Now, the situation was not that egregious. At the time, NATO was a collection of 28 militaries and Iceland. Sorry, but I have to do that for accuracy's sake. The organization itself owns basically no hardware. The United States, United Kingdom, France, and so forth were free to have their own individualized war plans, and undoubtedly they did. Moreover, for a good chunk of the modern period, a collective war plan seemed unnecessary. The Cold War was over, and the West had won. In the meantime, the plans to fight the Soviet Union had been rendered irrelevant. Not only did the dissolution of the Eastern Bloc mean that NATO no longer had to worry about communist troops storming in from East Germany or Poland, a whole bunch of that bloc was literally now a part of NATO. What's more, for a long period after September 2001, the security focus was on unconventional threats, mostly coming out of the Middle East, and certainly not out of Eastern Europe. Russia was actually a partner for a lot of that, with the Kremlin wanting to draw a connection between US efforts in Afghanistan and Russian efforts in Chechnya. After 2014, though, and Russia's annexation of Crimea, it became clear that NATO needed to return to its counter-Moscow roots, so to speak. And while I cannot explain why there was a 5-year delay, eventually 2019 produced a proper NATO defense plan, one that was not a loosely federated defense of Europe, but rather one that is a comprehensive battle plan, designed to exploit all of the alliance's strengths. One slight problem: the alliance did not actually have the materiel to pull it off. It was a phantom plan. Now, that did not mean that Europe was in imminent danger of defeat at the hands of Russia. Rather, the goal was to deter an invasion in the first place. But such a goal is a mixed bag. On one hand, the alliance may have felt that it could beat back Russia despite the lack of forethought. However, given Moscow's predilections that would be on full display in February 2022, perhaps NATO needed to go a bit over the top to guarantee its members' safety. Fast forward to 2025. Behind the scenes, the new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, dusted off the 2019 battle plans. There was much to do to update them. Tons of lessons coming out of Ukraine, from drones to new battlefield medicine. Then there was the knowledge that Kyiv would be a major partner in the event of a war, regardless of Ukraine's membership status. Plus there were 3 new members, never mind a huge new border to defend. That takes us back to the 3.5% of GDP target for core defense spending. Again, it was not a number pulled out of thin air. Rather, they added up all of the costs of the war plan. Then, they converted that to a percentage of GDP, which, if spent, would generate what they needed. That is how we got to 3.5%. Backing out the numbers here, with a total GDP of about $57 trillion, NATO collectively needs to spend about $2 trillion per year to handle the problem. Great. All I have to do now is see how that money is getting spent, and we can get the information that we need about US reliability, or at least European perceptions thereof. Ah, Dear William, that is classified. Regards, Secretary General Mark Rutte. P.S. My pleats are better than yours, and your viewers agree. Well, that just hurts, on many levels. But no matter. I need to stay focused, because I still have a mission to accomplish here. Now, it is not surprising that parts of the war plan are classified. For example, if NATO could counterattack to the north or to the south, then you would want to keep that information secret until the attack was underway. It might be more surprising to hear that the construction choices are also classified, and not just for super-secret new projects that no one knows about at all. Even something as simple as how many tanks Germany needs to produce remains classified, even though soon enough those orders will be placed, and the whole world will soon find out. The problem is that this information would reveal to Russia what NATO's weaknesses are in the meantime. And call me an armchair general, but revealing that information seems like a bad idea. The good news is that we do not need to know the full war plan or shopping list of items. We just need to know some generalities about the categories of purchases. As a starting point, it is telling that the origin of the 3.5% comes from the year 2019. Yes, that was still a Trump era. However, Trump's calls for a US withdrawal from NATO came at the beginning of his presidency, and you might say that the first half of his first term was a learning experience. He came in as a political outsider, who did not really understand the benefits that the United States enjoyed as being a part of NATO. Call it the education of Donald Trump. The back half of his first term shifted the rhetoric from withdrawal to more of a laser focus on increased defense spending and fulfillment of the pledge made in Wales. The point is, this was not the era of rampant concern that the United States was going to abandon Europe, in the way that sentiment is now common in 2025. That, in turn, suggests that the basis of the spending plan presupposes an American commitment. But that is a lot of hypotheticals, and at some point, you just have to ask. Unfortunately, my time with the Secretary General devolved into a brief discussion of hockey sticks. But that's a story for another video. Fortunately, I did have more time with Deputy Secretary General Radmila Shekarinska. You may have listened to the full interview already, but I asked her directly whether the new spending was focused on exploiting NATO's comparative advantages or otherwise. She told me,
each ally has received a specific set of capabilities, usually in areas where they are stronger, better. You know, we need a quantum leap, but we need a rational quantum leap. But of course, they will have to do more than they're used to. So there is a bit of an additional effort expected of everyone.
Upon re-listening to the interview, I was not sure about the part at the end where she said that the allies had to do more. That could be interpreted as spend significantly more on their comparative advantages, or do more beyond what their comparative advantages are. I therefore asked a NATO official for clarification, and was told that it meant the former. However, that was just one perspective. Trying to leave no stone unturned, it seemed like a good idea to hear from an ally rather than the organization. Looking around the flagpoles, there are a lot of options to choose from. But perhaps the best barometer here would be France. You may recall that France is the only country to ever withdraw from NATO's Integrated Military Command, which prompted a move of the NATO headquarters, at the time the bright buildings seen here in the foreground, to Brussels. And while France eventually returned to the Integrated Military Command in 2009, if any country was going to raise a serious issue about the current direction of the United States, it would be France. Well, I had a moment with Jean-Noël Barrot, the French foreign minister, and a PhD in economics. He is also a man with a citation count that puts mine to shame. Thank goodness for that H-index. Anyway, I asked him the hard question about NATO's spending priorities. Will it be comparative advantages or European independence?
Well, I think a little bit of both, actually. I think we need to further enhance our complementarities. France, the UK, the US are nations that have a nuclear deterrence capacity that contributes to the security of all members of the alliance. And so in a moment when all the members of the alliance are going to raise their defense spending, they also need to take into account the existence of this deterrence capacity to sort of better design or best design their own procurement and their own decisions in the field of conventional defense. But then, and I don't think this is in any contradiction, then we also need to develop a European industrial and technological defense basis in order to be more independent, in order to reach more interoperability within the European Union and the European continent, a basis, a technological and industrial defense basis that will also be useful for the US as they can procure from this European basis, which gives us more flexibility for their own procurement.
Now, that might sound like it has the hint of a fracture, but it is worth putting this in the context of where NATO actually sees the dangers in the world today. Given its historical legacy and the geographic position of all but 3 of its members, Russia will always receive the disproportionate focus. That goes double at a time when it is currently at war in Ukraine. At the same time, though, NATO recognizes where Russia is on the hierarchy of global threats. Take it away, Secretary General.
And we also know that there is a risk that if the Chinese would try anything with Taiwan, that no doubt he will call his junior partner, Mr. Putin, and make sure that the junior partner in that relationship with China, Mr. Putin, will keep us busy here.
Ouch. And that was not some sort of off-the-cuff comment either. Rutte would make the same junior partner comment at this press conference on the following day. But the reality of the situation is that Europe has plenty of economic interest in a calm Indo-Pacific. And if the PRC ever were to invade Taiwan, the United States would come to Taiwan's defense, and that would leave a window of opportunity for Russia to attack Europe. As a result, Europe needs some level of independence to deter that. Because, at the end of the day, the United States cannot do everything, everywhere, all at once. Moreover, the United States is in complete agreement that Europe should have independent procurement, even if it comes at the risk of reducing European orders from U.S. defense contractors, if for no other reason than it is hard for the United States' industrial capacity to bear all of that. Look no further than what has been a constant problem in Ukraine, with the United States not having enough 155mm artillery shells to cover Kyiv's needs, while maintaining its own reserve supply. This is not just a concern of the Trump administration, of course. It also put significant limits on donations coming through during the Biden administration. And you can only imagine how supply constrained the United States would be if it were the one shooting off their artillery rounds, be the target Russia or China. Simply put, there needs to be in excess of 155mm production globally, so that everyone in the Western coalition can properly arm themselves. And as the French foreign minister pointed out, Europe's own production lines improve US procurement capacity. All of that is written into the closest thing that we have to a white paper on Trump doctrine. And increasing European capacity is a way that we discussed recently may help stop World War III, something that both sides of the Atlantic have an interest in. Of course, this is still a bunch of talk. It has given us a little more clarity about the situation than when we started, but the questions still remain. Pretty soon, though, the new metal will actually start being cast, and that will tell you everything that you might want to know. Meanwhile, if you want to learn more about how we got here, these 2 books on the war make a great starting point. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.